Our website, CNN.com, is launching an effort to help locate people who are missing in New York. If you have a picture of a missing friend or relative, go to our website and follow the instructions there. Send us the picture along with a contact number.
There's been tough talk from U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He describes Tuesday's attack as an assault on the American way of life. The Defense Secretary has warned that protecting the country from terrorists will require, quote, a war and a sustained effort. While U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has named the Saudi-born Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect, Rumsfeld has been more circumspect on that score, but he warns that any action the U.S. takes against any perpetrators would be justified.
I don't think of it as retaliation. I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as self-defense. The United States of America has every right to defend itself. And that is what it is about. It is consciously saying that countries and entities and people who actively oppose the United States and damage our interests by acts of violence, acts of war, are our enemies. And they are people and organizations and entities and states that we have every right to defend ourselves against.
Pakistan is asking the United States for time to consider a list of U.S. demands. The United States says it needs Pakistan to help find those responsible for the terrorist attacks. Our State Department correspondent Andrea Koppel has details.
Tightening the diplomatic screws on Pakistan's president, the Bush administration presented a list of specific steps it says Pakistan must take. Among them, to share information on what it knows about Tuesday's attacks and Osama bin Laden's terrorist network, to close the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan and cut off fuel shipments, and eventually to provide the United States with use of Pakistani airspace if needed.
We haven't yet publicly identified the organization we believe was responsible. But when you look at the list of candidates, one resides in that region.
Later, when pressed by reporters,
when you spoke of a candidate who resides in that region, were you speaking of Osama bin Laden?
Yes.
For the first time, Powell saying publicly what many have said privately, that bin Laden's network, based in Afghanistan, is a prime suspect. And as Afghanistan's neighbor and longtime supporter, Pakistan could play a critical role in finding bin Laden and shutting down his terrorist training camps for good. Following another full day of intense meetings and conversations between U.S. and Pakistani officials, President Musharraf assured the Bush administration of Pakistan's unstinted cooperation in the fight against terrorism. He said Pakistan is ready to commit all of its resources to locate and punish those responsible for the attacks in New York and Washington.
President Musharraf is in a difficult position. He has aided the Taliban for a number of years. But also he needs the United States very badly right now. We are improving our relations with India. He can't afford, I think, to antagonize the United States.
State Department officials say early indications from Pakistan are, quote, very positive. Still, Secretary Powell acknowledged with economic sanctions in place, the U.S. has very little leverage to turn up the heat. But he says the U.S. could make life a lot easier in Pakistan if its government cooperates. Andrea Koppel, CNN, at the State Department.
And Tom Mantier joins us now live from Islamabad. Tom, what has been the domestic reaction in Pakistan to President Musharraf's support for the U.S.?
Ralitza, we may be able to judge that in about 10 minutes. At 3 mosques across Islamabad, there are going to be prayers said for the American victims of this tragedy. So the public will have their chance to speak out. But as Andrea was saying in her piece, it is a very difficult situation that the Pakistani president finds himself in, because there are going to be domestic ramifications if indeed Pakistan cooperates with the United States in any type of military action in Afghanistan. The streets may be set alight here with protesters. And you have to look at where the Pakistani president comes from. He comes from the military side, not the political side, so he doesn't have any real political support as a politician might have, because he's really gone out to clean up politics in Pakistan, so he really can't count on them. There are divisions within the military as far as support for the Taliban is concerned, so he's really in a very tight spot. But when you look at the economy of Pakistan, which is in a shambles right now, with Musharraf also going to the World Bank and others trying to seek loans to improve the economic situation here, that could be in jeopardy if he goes against the United States and swims upstream on this. So there is subtle pressure that is coming in the front door and not so subtle pressure to cooperate with the U.S. in its efforts to gather intelligence on Osama bin Laden and provide even access to the airspace if there was indeed a military strike against targets in Afghanistan. So he's really in a tough spot here politically and militarily. So he's really walking a very fine line. He has said unstinted support. What everyone is waiting to see is if push comes to shove, what unstinted really means. Ralitza?
And Tom, what about pressures from religious groups?
It is those religious groups that really make up the big problem domestically that he's going to have. If there are people out in the streets, as they were the last time there was an attack against Afghanistan, making demonstrations and burning flags, if this was a long, sustained campaign, air campaign against Afghanistan, there would be a long campaign of terror on the streets of places like Islamabad and Karachi and Lahore and elsewhere in Pakistan. So there is a real domestic problem for the government here if they side with the United States. If they don't side with the United States, the problems, though, may be even bigger.
Tom, thank you.
Whatever the stakes in Pakistan or elsewhere, for many Americans, the shock from Tuesday's attacks has given way to anger and cries for revenge, many directed against Osama bin Laden. U.S. officials say more than one terrorist group may have been involved in the attacks, though, and as CNN's David Ensor reports, getting at bin Laden may prove to be a very difficult task.
The nation is angry about thousands of innocent deaths. U.S. officials say the evidence so far points to Osama bin Laden's group, and the Bush administration is talking tough.
We will go after that group, that network, and those who have harbored, supported, and aided that network to rip the network up. And when we're through with that network, we will continue with a global assault against terrorism in general.
But if it is bin Laden, how to get at him and his top lieutenants? Some argue for giving Afghanistan's Taliban government an ultimatum. Turn him over or else.
We know where your ministries are. We know where your houses are. We're simply going to obliterate them from the face of the planet.
Bouncing that rubble with a lot of B-52 loads of bombs, I don't think is going to change Afghanistan all that much.
No, say most analysts in and out of government. If you want to roll up bin Laden and al-Qaeda, it is going to take more than bombs. It will take ground troops.
In order for us to preserve America and our way of life, we're going to have to sacrifice American treasure and, unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps some American blood.
It is not just a question of grabbing or killing one man or even 20. There are a dozen or more training camps, U.S. intelligence says, producing more terrorists dedicated to killing Americans.
Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
And much of bin Laden's base of support is in neighboring Pakistan, through which money from around the Arab world is funneled to the al-Qaeda coffers. It is a treacherous and dangerous area indeed.
If you start moving in ground troops and you're willing to occupy countries for long periods of time, you do change things rather significantly for terrorists. I'm not sure this country is ready to do that, even if it does have a fit of passion right now, and it may or may not make sense for the U.S. to do that in its larger interests.
Bottom line, U.S. forces might be able to get bin Laden, but that alone would not stop the terror. Administration officials saying they will do nothing precipitous, knowing this one is going to be very, very difficult. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
Who to punish and how? We're joined now from London by Fred Halliday, a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and a specialist on the region. Thanks so much for talking with us. The talk here is Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. Does it make sense to punish Afghanistan if indeed he is the man behind these attacks?
It certainly makes sense to punish those who have trained and supported Osama bin Laden's organization over many years. We don't know the full details of the training that went into this mission, but if, as it appears, the pilots who carried out the suicide missions in Washington, New York, were actually trained on, albeit old, but nevertheless jets, passenger jets that were left behind in Afghanistan, that would be very significant. But overall, he cannot operate in Afghanistan without the say-so of the Taliban government. And for all that they'll say, oh, he's just a guest, or things in Afghanistan are very fragmented, they have responsibility, not just under international law, but in practice. You and I couldn't go there and set up an organization. We'd be dead in 2 minutes. So it is quite an effective system of rule, and they are responsible. The problem about punishing Afghanistan as a country is it's taken more punishment than any other country in the world in the last 20 years. Economically, in terms of refugees, it is a devastated country. And that, of course, is something that has to be balanced against the desire to punish those who supported bin Laden. But I have to add, the Taliban themselves have a patron, and the patron is Pakistan. In effect, that is a client government of Pakistan. They provide many of its security and military personnel. They set them up in business. They may not be responsible for everything the Taliban do, but the trail of responsibility has to go to Pakistan as well as to Afghanistan. What that means for U.S. diplomacy is for others to say.
Let me ask you, to your mind, what is going through the minds of the leadership of the Taliban right now? Do they want to tough this one out? Do they want to make a deal? What do you think they're saying in Kandahar and Kabul right now?
Well, remember that the Sudanese government supported some terrorist actions on a much lower level years ago, and then in the end they did a kind of a split. They let one group go, Osama bin Laden, go and sent him to Afghanistan, and they handed over another one, Carlos the Jackal, from the Sudan. Now, the Taliban, I think, are thinking also they don't want to go down the tube entirely, but they support military actions against neighboring states, including, I would stress, Iran, who they detest. They've supported military actions in Central Asia, and they support this more militant view of Islamic fundamentalism as being something which is at war with the West. It's clear in their rhetoric, it's true in their actions. Secondly, they must have helped prepare this operation. And if it goes well for them, and if it goes well for Osama bin Laden, the consequence will be very simple but very important. It's a recruiting measure, a very gruesome, cruel, but calculated recruiting measure. They're not going to defeat the United States. They don't think for a minute that they can do that. It's not like Vietnam fighting the US in the 70s. They are carrying out these actions. They're what the anarchists call propaganda of the deed, to punish the enemy, but also to recruit. On a smaller scale, that was the purpose behind the destruction of the Buddhist statues last March. It was to say to radical Muslims, we're standing up to these people, we're not going to take any notice. However, if the cost looks like it's going to be too high, they could do anything, and they could indeed even surrender bin Laden or say he'd had a car accident.
How, in theory, would the United States, how would the West make Afghanistan pay if Afghanistan's already fought itself into rubble through long years of civil war, if the government is insensitive to the poverty and suffering its people already feel? What can be done?
Well, I think there are two things that can be done, and I know that every politician and diplomat in the world is thinking of this. I'm not saying anything original. On the one hand, those in the Taliban leadership and in the associated special services of Pakistan who were associated with this, as well as Osama bin Laden, can be attacked, can be arrested, can be dealt with in whatever way is possible. I'm not sure whether the United States wants to bring them back in a Noriega-like way and put them in a Florida jail, or whether they would be happy to have a bloody battle there. But it's to destroy the leadership who were responsible in the Qaeda organization of bin Laden, in the Taliban, and in Pakistan for this. That's number one. It has to be counterbalanced by political limits for the population of Afghanistan, for whom we have a responsibility anyway, since the West helped create the mess there, in fact, largely helped create the mess there in recent years. But secondly, there have to be countervailing measures to show that this is not a war with the third world or the Islamic world. And I would say that there has to be more diplomatic activity to address the other issues that have fueled this. That goes from Kashmir in the east through to the Gulf problems, through to the Palestine question. In other words, there has to be not just military containment of what's done, but countervailing long-term diplomatic activity.
Professor Halliday,